Today I'm in the botanical gardens of the Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, and behind me is a seating area made up of stones that are over 800 years old and originate from a Spanish monastery about 90 miles north of Madrid in the Castile region of Spain, in a monastery known as Santa Maria de Avila. Now, Santa Maria de Avila was built in 1181 and was consecrated in September of 1213. And despite being one of the smallest monasteries in the region of Castile, it enjoyed 4 centuries of prosperity. Around the 15th century, though, the area surrounding Santa Maria de Avila began to see a slow decline. This is due to the War of Spanish Succession as well as the Peninsular War, and eventually the monastery ceased to operate in 1835 after a law declaring that minor religious holdings housing fewer than 12 residents were to be forfeit to the state. And this monastery only had 4 monks and 1 lay brother. The new owners of Santa Maria de Avila were well-to-do farmers who didn't care much for the buildings, using them as a hostel, as well as barns for agriculture and sheltering livestock. And the chapter house was used as a manure pit, with other buildings being used as storage. As late as the early 20th century, small trees were seen growing in the dirt atop the monastery roofs. The question is, how did 800-year-old stones from Spain, literally half a world away, end up here in the botanical gardens of San Francisco? And that all comes down to one man, William Randolph Hearst. Well, in 1928, the Spanish state sold the monastery to Fernando Belloso for a little more than 3,100 pesetas, which was about $600 to $700. Belloso, director of the Spanish Credit Bank in Madrid, already owned areas around the monastery, including irrigated grain fields and forests. Arthur Bine, an art agent living in Madrid, whose biggest client was the newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst, was working for Hearst to acquire an old monastery in 1930. Previously, in 1925, Bine had bought Hearst the monastery of Santa Maria de Real de Sacramento, which was dismantled, crated, and shipped to New York, where it was stored in a warehouse in the Bronx. Not much was done with it until 1954, when it was reassembled in Florida as a tourist attraction before being acquired by the Episcopal Diocese of South Florida. Bine talked to Belloso about helping him acquire another monastery, and Belloso invited him to see the old Avila Monastery in December of 1930, after which Bine sent photographs and sketches to Hearst for his approval. In his transactions, he referred to the proposal as Mount Olive, most likely to misdirect Spanish authorities who were in charge of protecting historical artifacts. After Hearst conveyed his enthusiasm for the project, Belloso sold Bine the stones for $85,000, including the cloister, the chapter house, the refectory, and the dormitory, as well as the old church portal. Hearst paid a little under $100,000, roughly equivalent to $1.4 million as of 2021. Each stone was carefully labeled as it was dismantled. To move all the stones, Bine had a road built to the Tagus River, and a barge attached to a fixed cable was assigned to ferry stones across. They used an old World War I trench railway, which was brought in to transport stones from the monastery to the ferry, its rails being able to be laid into any of the buildings. One of the biggest problems, though, was that the factories in Spain could not make enough packing material to keep the crate packing crew supplied, which slowed down efforts. The project was rushed along in fear that it might be halted at any time by authorities. Spanish law had prohibited the removal of historic artifacts, but the Spanish government at the time was in disarray and did not enforce the law. Government officials simply looked the other way as trucks hauled 700-year-old stones to the dock. Anytime new officials stopped the project, Bine's lawyer persuaded the ministry to allow it to continue, saying that the project employed more than 100 men and put money into a severely depressed economy. By the time the dismantling was finished, on July 1st, 1931, some 10,000 stones weighing a total of 2,000 tons were shipped on 11 different freighters through the Panama Canal all the way to San Francisco. The monastery project had cost Hearst about $1 million, which was equal to about $17 million today. Now, Hearst first bought the monastery intending to replace his family retreat at Wintun, up near Mount Shasta in Northern California. And as the stones came into the port of San Francisco, they each were inspected. There were several thousand crates in all. The Hazlitt warehouse between Fisherman's Wharf and the Hyde Street Pier was used for storage. Groundbreaking was set for July of 1931, despite the fact that the last freighter carrying the stones was still en route. But Hearst had to put a stop to the plan because his fortunes were far too reduced due to the Great Depression. The stones ended up staying in the warehouse, incurring a $15,000 storage fee each year. By 1940, Hearst had decided to give the stones away. The Spanish government requested that they be returned to Spain, but Hearst refused, and in 1941, Herbert Fleischhacker, director of the M.H.D. Young Memorial Museum, convinced convinced Hearst to give the stones to the city of San Francisco in exchange for the city's payment of his $25,000 storage debt. Hearst requested that the stones be used to construct a group of museum buildings adjoining the DeYoung Museum in the Golden Gate Park. The city moved the crates from the warehouse and stored them behind the museum in the Japanese tea garden. Despite several efforts, the city was unable to raise money to build the museum, and several fires ended up damaging the stones. They were weakened or cracked from sudden cooling by water. Hearst eventually died in 1951, not having seen anything built with the stones. And after all of the fires, little more than half of the stones were able to be used in construction anyway. In 1965, the Museum Society raised money in order to mount the grand portal of the old church, and it was installed in the DeYoung Museum, the centerpiece of Hearst Court, in the main exhibit hall. The rest of the stones were abandoned by the museum, and in May 1969, with the announcement that there would be no reconstruction. After this, stones were occasionally taken by park workers and used to decorate Golden Gate Park. In 1989, performance artist Michael Bowen took some of them and arranged them into a circle, citing religious use for Hinduism, eventually admitting that the whole thing was a performance piece. In 1999, the stones were arranged here as a reading area next to this library, joining the Helen Crocker Russell Library of Horticulture here in the Botanical Gardens in Golden Gate Park. Thanks for watching, and as always, until next time, get lost.